I'm extremely thankful to all the subscribers, to all the followers of my YouTube channel, of my YouTube lectures, and I humbly announce my apology for not being in YouTube live or not being able to shoot YouTube videos for a long time. And I know, I mean, you have been waiting for my YouTube videos and for my live session for a long time. But as you know, I have been busy. 10,000 webinars in 5 zillion conferences all over the world. There is an international webinar, there is an international conference every day of the week. And I keep presenting papers in all the conferences and all the webinars. So what that does do, that takes away sort of my option of shooting YouTube videos or going live in my own YouTube channel. That limits me a lot. So I tender my humble apology for that. But here I am with a fresh new YouTube live session. The thing is that I have been meaning to shoot this video, or I have been meaning to go live in my own YouTube channel about a topic that is very sort of close to my heart. Yes, I will be talking about detective novel, I will be talking about detective fiction, and I will be talking about one of the very problematic detective writer amongst all, and in a particular genre which is predominantly dominated by male writers. So we talk about Sherlock Holmes, you talk about Edgar Allan Poe, and and you may talk about plenty of others. But the thing that is interesting is that there is a woman who is absolutely amazing, and her name is Agatha Christie. Yes, and we know how we all are fond of Agatha Christie. Now, who is Agatha Christie? Agatha Christie is that a detective writer who changed the entire dynamics of detective novel. So, and before I talk about anything pertaining to Agatha Christie, and before I talk about anything pertaining to any of the novels of Christie, let us focus a little bit about the genre of detective novel, about the genre of detective literature per se, and how detective novel came about, when did it come about, and when it eventually did come about, why did it become so extraordinarily popular, particularly between the two world wars, and what was the reason behind the popularity? Was it related to any kind of socio-economic, political, cultural condition of West Europe, particularly between the First World War and the Second World War? And when we talk about all these things, we have to understand that something very interesting was happening between the two world wars. Now, what was happening between the two world wars? Now, the First World War took place from 1914 and I believe to 1918. So The second decade is the decade of World War One, the First World War, and the Second World War happened, if I'm not mistaken, from 19 say 37, 38, and then it went on to continue till the 1942, 1940s. So it began in the late 30s and continued throughout the earlier phases of the 40s decade of the 20th century. So these are the two world wars that humanity witnessed in the 20s and in the late 30s and early 40s. Now, if we see detective novel, we would see that detective novel became very, very, very popular between 1920s and 1930s. I'll say it again. The detective novel became popular just after the First World War had finished and just prior to the beginning of the Second World War. That is to say, detective fiction became popular in the 1930s and also throughout the 30s and sometimes also in the early 40s and sometimes in the late 20s as well. Now, when we talk about the popularity of detective fiction during that period, instead of talking about the popularity of detective novel, let us talk a little bit about the socio-cultural economic condition of West Europe during that period, that is the 1930s and prior to it and also after the 1930s. Now, First World War ravaged everything. It totally unsettled Europe. It comprehensively upset the socio-cultural, political, economic dynamics of West Europe. Yes, it did, very much did so. But having said that, it didn't end with the conclusion of the First World War. Yes, the First World War ended sometime in the 1980s. I'm sorry, 1918, and so the late 20s. So when the First World War ended, then socio-cultural condition of Europe remained continuously disturbed, if anything, more disturbed than the period when the First World War was happening, that is throughout the 20s decade. So my point is that the 1930s decade, I'll say it again and I'll go slow because I want the students of English literature of honors third semester of Bardhaman University, Calcutta University, Pullen University, North Bengal University, because I know, because I know for a fact that there are students who are listening to my lecture who are from different universities, English Honors UG of third semester. So it doesn't matter which university you study, which college you study, but all the English honors students must understand one very simple thing. And what is that simple thing? That 1930s remained a very disturbing decade throughout the entire West world. It was incredibly disturbing, the 1930s. So the 1930s was socially disturbed because the fabric of the society collapsed. It was culturally disturbed because the dynamics of relationship crumbled along with it. It was politically disturbing, and more importantly, it was economically disturbing as well. Because, I mean, those who were engaged in the First World War were absolutely bankrupt. Yes, they were absolutely bankrupt, hands down. And because of the fact that they went absolutely bankrupt, so the humanity in general uh, was facing its crisis head on. So what I am saying basically is that the society didn't have any balance, didn't have any social, political, cultural, or even economic equilibrium. It was a very disturbing period. They have just the way we talk about First World War, the way we talk about Second World War in 21st century was not the way we can talk about the First World War when it was happening or just after it had just happened. So, for example, we are talking about coronavirus in a language that would be very different from the way people would talk about coronavirus, say, five decades later. I mean, when people would be talking about coronavirus in the middle of the 21st century, I mean, their lingo would not be similar to the lingo that we guys have been using. So, when human beings witnessed the World War for the first time in the history of human civilization and culture, so what happened? They were rattled. Humanity was rattled big time. Humanity was rattled big time. And what happened? That they were doing everything they could to restore the old order back. They were doing everything to sort of restore the old order back, the old cultural stability back, the old economic equilibrium back, to bring the old social stability back. But the problem is that when they were trying to do that, they knew deep down inside, the people of the 1930s, I mean, don't live under the illusion that I'm talking about the 20th century in general. I'm talking about the 1930s decade in particular. I repeat, I'm talking about 1930s decade in particular. So the 1930s, when it began, the early 1930s, was doing everything it could to bring the old stability back, to bring the old equilibrium and the balance back. But it was not happening. It was very unlikely that they could bring that old order back, the order that was there before the beginning of the First World War, right? So what happened when they were trying to bring that old order back? They were looking for something. I'll be talking about, I'll be deconstructing that something, maybe say 4 or 5 minutes later. But meanwhile, let's stick to that something for the time being. So they were looking for something that would bring, what would that bring? That would bring the order back. What kind of order? The order that was there before the beginning of the World War I. Now, when they were doing that, they would love, in the 30s, in the 1930s, right? They would love a character who would walk in. I'm going very slow for the students. Who would walk in? They were looking for a character who would walk in and solve. I would love to use the solve in quotation. I love my quotations. You all know that. They would love a character who would solve all the unsettling, disturbing problems they were having during the 1930s or the earlier parts of the 1930s and also the late 1920s too. Now, who could that be? let's slow down slightly and let's ponder for the time being on that character. Who could that be? Who could that be? Who could that be who can come in and solve the problems and go away having solved the problem, and all the characters around him would have the illusion of having restored the old order back? I would request all the students listening to my YouTube live be very careful about this a particular segment of my lecture right now. Please don't miss this particular segment that I am in the middle of right now. And I believe that character is the character of detective. Yes, you heard me right. That character is the character of detective. Now, who is a detective? Now, we all know that we are all familiar about Sherlock Holmes. We are all familiar about Bromkes Bokshi's. We are all familiar about Feludas. Meanwhile, I wish Soumitra sir very speedy recovery. I hope we keep our fingers crossed. So when we are talking about detective, what specifically do we tend to talk about? No, honestly, detective is someone who walks into a world. Now I will be deconstructing the narrative of detective fiction one by one after the another. I'll be very meticulously critical about all these layers and sub-layers and sub-sub-layers and sub-sub-sub-sub-sub-layers of detective fiction and the narrative of it. Now, who is this guy? And again, and everyone know, whenever RSM would be talking about anything, gender will come in. I mean, I'm sure everybody is waiting for me to use the word gender somewhere in the middle of my lecture. Yes, you do not have to wait for long for me to announce gender in the middle of my lecture. Here I am with my gender. Now, when we talk about detectives, let's ask of which gender. 99.9999%. I'm sorry, 99.99999% times detective fiction is usually constituted of a male character. That is to say, detective is invariably male. I will be coming back to the masculinity of the characterization of the detective a little later. But let's not get into the gender studies of the detective fiction because many of you might become upset. Oh no, Sad again has stopped teaching us detective novel and he has again started his masculinity studies and queer theory and detective novel. Particularly some of the students I know will be cursing me right now. No, Sad is not starting out with his gender studies lecture right now. Sad is sticking to detective novel lecture. So when we talk about the detective, we talk about a male detective, yes. And the second thing is that the male detective walks into a world which is topsy-turvy. Now, what the hell is that? Topsy-turvy. Okay, topsy-turvy is a world where everything has been turned upside down. The value system. See, this is the pain. So if I use this is topsy-turvy, or this is topsy-turvy, this is topsy-turvy. So everything is upset. Everything, the whole system of order is comprehensively jeopardized. We do not have any stable value system. We do not have any stable order. We do not have a stable sort of balanced bourgeois equilibrium that we usually tend to have in our capitalist worlds. So what is the situation? So detective walks into a world where a crime takes place. So whenever we start reading any detective novel, I know I am talking about Murder of Roger Ackroyd today, but before I talk about Murder of Roger Ackroyd, I have to talk about Agatha Christie. But before I talk about Agatha Christie, I have to talk about Agatha Christie as a female detective novelist. And before I talk about, I have to talk about detective fiction in general. And before I talk about detective fiction, I have to talk about the context in which detective fiction was emerging, and not only was emerging, it was emerging with extraordinary popularity. So it became more popular than the True Love meme that we are using today. So yes, it's true. So it became more popular than the True Love meme that is doing the rounds in social media in this day and age of the time. So the thing is that the detective, the male detective, enters into a world whose value system is totally gone. And that's why a crime like murder takes place when the detective novel begins or opens. I want everyone to realize this. This is significant. Detective novel invariably begins with crime, as heinous as murder. As heinous as murder. And when detective novel begins with a heinous crime like murder, then what happens? Invariably, the narrative brings someone who is potentially capable of reconciling the problem and solving the crime or the murder that had happened prior to it. So the detective comes, and what is he supposed to do? I'm saying he because this is unhappily or unfortunately or sadly masculinist. Yes, I'll come back to this, and it's not because I would bring gender everywhere, but because gender is everywhere. And RSM brings gender everywhere. No, RSM does not bring gender everywhere. Gender is everywhere. Gender is everywhere. I don't see gender everywhere. Gender actually is everywhere. No, why? Okay, fine. Gender is not everywhere. I understand that. Then why does the detective always have to be a male? No, you tell me, why does the detective always have to be male? Why can't he be a female? What's wrong with the detective being a female character? What's wrong with the novelist of detective fiction being a female character? Like Agatha herself was? So I will try and answer those questions in the back end of this YouTube live. So meanwhile, let's concentrate on how a detective novel and the narrative of it begins and opens up. So a detective enters into a world whose value system is totally gone to the dogs. And when the value system is gone, what happens? Crime begins to happen. And crime becomes more and more frequent. And so we are not at all surprised that it begins with a murder. For example, murder of Roger Ackroyd. It begins exactly and very unsurprisingly also with a murder. Next topic that I would want all my students to focus on is the economic condition of the person being murdered right in the beginning of the detective narrative. The person who gets murdered invariably is a feudal lord. In order to help my students listening very carefully to this live, I would like to bring a comparison with Satyajit Ray and his take on detective narrative and the Sherlock Holmes, and obviously with Agatha Christie's narrativization as well. Now, I'm sure all the uh, uh, students who are listening to this lecture right now are familiar with all the detective narratives of Satyajit Ray. Now, when Soumitra or the characters who used to play that role of a detective, they used to remember they used to go to houses for investigation. Now, what kind of houses they used to go to? What kind of houses they used to go to? Most of the houses where murder takes place and the detective goes to investigate, those houses are old zamindari house. That is in Bengali, পুরনো জমিদার বাড়ি, ভাঙাচোরা পুরনো জোরদার বাড়ি. Now be very careful about what I'm about to say right now. Not a single occasion has Satyajit Ray shown us that his detective is going to a house which is a South City mall or which is a new flat or apartment in South Kolkata. It's invariably a dilapidated, old, crumbling, ancient house or haveli of bygone zamindari days of old Kolkata, North Kolkata, or say old zamindari house of Murshidabad, say in Lalbagh or in other parts of the Murshidabad, or in the remoter part of Hooghly or in Purulia. But three features are very common. The murder takes place, the detective goes there to investigate and detect the crime, and the murder spot is invariably a ruined, dilapidated, broken, old feudal zamindari bygone house. Now, this is exactly where we have to dig deep and think long and bloody hard. Because those old zamindari houses, most of them, what do they represent? No, honestly, seriously, what do they actually represent? They represent old values. And what is the condition of this zamindari house right now? It's dilapidated. It's almost in a ruined state. পুরনো জমিদারি ভাঙাচোরা হানা বাড়ি, that we often say in Bengali. So these zamindari houses, they represent old values of feudal ages. And remember the old value that I was talking about just when I have begun this YouTube live. And that old value, what was I saying just 10 or 15 or 20 minutes earlier? That old values are gone. And that's why crime happens. And that's why most of the detective novels started becoming very, 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 very popular, particularly after the First World War, from early 1930s onwards. So, what is my point here? My point is that those old houses of Satyajit Ray's, or even the murder of Roger Ackroyd. So, if you see murder of Roger Ackroyd, the crime takes place in a house that is old, feudal, but in a state of ruin. And the old zamindar, the ancient landlord, is murdered. So, is the old house an old house, or does it represent the older values and older ideologies which are murdered and therefore dead and therefore gone and therefore are no more? Particularly, World War has taken place. And therefore, the detective comes in to detect what? Detect and investigate the ways how he could bring the old order back. And once he could detect through his investigation the criminal, or should I say the murderer, he could bring the old order back. And once he could bring that old order back, the novel will end. Because the readers, particularly after the First World War, I'll say it again, because the readers, particularly after the World War I, late 20s and early 1930s, were searching for, were looking for, I said something. Did you remember I said something? And I also promised that I would deconstruct that something later. This is the deconstruction of that something now. And the readers, they are basically looking for that something which was there. And what does the detective do? The detective does not only detect and investigate the crime. Having detected and having investigated the crime, the detective actually brings the old feudal order back. Obviously, the readers are happy. Oh my God, the old order, the old feudal nostalgia has finally been restored back to us. And we have always wanted that. So the detective novel is not a detection of a crime. Mm, mm. So the detective novel is not a detection of crime. It is actually a detection of the process of the restoration of the order that existed before the World War I. And the happiness of the characters and readers around that detection through investigation of the detective is not the detection. It is actually the happiness at having found, or should I say, rediscovered the old order back through the detection of the detective or the investigator. Therefore, detective novel is actually a promise of a restoration of old feudal order, something that World War crumbled, something that World War annihilated, something that World War devastated. But the colonial readers were not ready to accept this ruin. So the male detective comes with the hope, optimism of rediscovering that old order back to them, to you and me, and to all the readers reading the detective novel, watching Satyajit Ray's Feluda, studying Agatha Christie's Murder of Rajat or the Murder of the Orient Express. Now, let us focus now on the gendered nature of the detective novel. Most of the detectives are male, and most of the detective novelists are also male. I'll repeat it again. Most of the detectives are male. Only 99.9999% detectives are male. And only 99.99% novelists are male. Only 99.99%. Not more than that. Very tiny amount of 99.99%. So, this suggests two things. So, this explains two things. And what are those two things? One, that detective novels are primarily patriarchal, and two, they are mostly bourgeois. And you know how capitalism depends on both of them, on bourgeois and on patriarchy. Now, why are you saying that detective novels are primarily patriarchal, should I say? Okay. Detective novels are primarily patriarchal because the detective is the father figure. So there is a problem in your house. Children probably have slapped each other, and the father, the angry father, I was taking a class in my college this morning, and I was telling about a book in which I have contributed. Uh, uh, the book that are being edited by uh, my colleague, and there I have contributed an essay in that book of my colleague, where I have talked that men are not allowed any expressions excepting one. Men are not allowed any expression excepting one, that is anger. Men are only allowed to be angry. Angry young man. नाम तो सुना ही होगा, science. So that genre, something that Amitabh Bachchan started, or even in Look Back in Anger, something that you will be reading in 5th semester by John Osborne. So that emotion of anger is the only emotion that men are allowed. And what about other emotions? No. If you are a man, then you are not allowed any other expression other than being angry. You are only allowed to be angry and angry and angry. So, therefore, men are not allowed to cry. Men are not allowed to ride bike with helmet. Men are not allowed to be shy. Men are not allowed to wear shirts. Men are not allowed to be sitting in the home and reading books and doing researches or writing novels. Men are only allowed to go out, even in coronavirus, and fight among each other, ride bikes and kill each other, kill the pole, kill the wall, kill yourself, kill all the men, kill all the women. Men are only allowed to fight, abuse, slangs. Men are only allowed to be destructive. Men are only allowed to be angry. So I was telling my college students this morning that men are only allowed one expression, that is the expression of anger. And if you know only how to be angry, you are a proper true blue man. Good luck to your manhood and your masculinity. আমার আন্তরিক শুভেচ্ছা রইল তোমার মর্দাঙ্গী এবং পৌরুষত্বের উৎসবের জন্য। Now, when we talk about man, we also talk about man in terms of father, because father figure, listen to me very carefully, because father figure is probably the greatest example of patriarchy in our culture, in our society, in our value system. I'll say it again. Father figure is probably the best and the greatest example of patriarchy that we can ever have in our family, in our relationship, and in our culture. So fathers will come into the house, and suppose children are fighting amongst each other. So they will stop fighting, and the arrival of the father suggests the solution of the problem among children. So similarly, the detective is like the male patriarch. The detective is like a male patriarch. And what does he do? He walks in like a patriarchal father into the family. And when children are fighting amongst each other in the house, suddenly they stop fighting. And he detects the crime, and he detects the gandogol, and he detects the problem and solves the problem, and sometimes slaps the problem or hands over the criminal to the police custody, and the investigation is completed thereby and therefore. So, who is the detective? I don't think detective is someone who detects the crime. Detective is not someone who detects the crime. No. Shit. Absolute bullshit. Or cow dung. So detective is someone who is a bloody patriarch. And the arrival of that bloody patriarch means the solution and reconciliation of the crime that had happened before. So invariably, whenever he comes, he solves the problem. He sorts everything out. And with the reconciliation and solution of those problems, through the investigation and detection of the detective, the old order comes back all over again to the middle class, to the bourgeois, to you and me. So, we love the detective. We love our Sherlock Holmes. We love our Bomkesh Bakshis. We love our Feludas. And all those and all these. Now, when we talk about Feluda, let us talk about another Da, that is Derrida. When we talk about Tenida, when we talk about Feluda, when we talk about Borda, Mesda, let us talk about my favorite Da, that is Derrida. Yes, it's my Borda. And Derrida is saying, Il n'y a pas de hors texte. That is, there is no outside text. So something that is already inside the text, I'll be deconstructing right now. And I have titled this YouTube live, Deconstructing Detective Fiction. And this is the deconstruction. This is the deconstructing. That is the deconstructing happening right now. Something that one of my very favorite students from Baharampur College, Pulok, is so fond of. And I am sure Pulok is absolutely glued to this YouTube live right now. So, hi Pulok. So this is something that is how we can deconstruct the detective fiction and the narrative. So there I go. In Murder of Roger Ackroyd, the detective is not a hegemonic masculine man. And those who are not familiar with my masculinity studies, I would like to tell them in very short that there are three masculinities according to R.W. Connell, an Australian professor from New South Wales, Sydney. And what is Connell saying is that there are three masculinities. The top layer is hegemonic masculinity. There is a middle tier, that is complicit masculinity. There is the third or the bottom tier, that is the subordinate masculinity. The hegemonic masculinity is the masculinity of Huru Huru Dabang Dabang or Huru Huru Kabir Singh and all those Huru Hurus. And those are hegemonic men. Those John Abrahams, those Sunny Deols, and those Salman Khans, they represent hegemonic masculinity. They will go to gym daily. They will do push-ups. They will lift weights, and they will have 2-pack, 3-pack, 7-pack, 10-pack, 15-pack, 20-pack. But there is complicit masculinity who will not have those 6-pack, 10-packs, 15-packs, 20-packs. They will have a huge belly, that is a family pack. Buri bole Banglai jake. Buri is also pack, and I don't think it is a 10 pack, 15 pack, 20 pack. I think it is a family pack. Yes, Buri is a family pack. and they are complicit men. And who are complicit men? They are not nurse or gym goers themselves, but they would sort of uh, secretly, privately, but genuinely and heartily support hegemonic masculinity. So they are complicit masculinity. They are men who belong to complicit masculinity. Now the third tier, that is hegemonic masculinity, I have explained. I have explained the complicit masculinity, and now I'll be explaining the third tier of masculinity, that is subordinate masculinity. Subordinate masculinity belongs to those men who are not hegemonic, who are neither hegemonic nor complicit, but they are absolute challenge to patriarchy. That is, they neither go to gym nor they support the hegemonic men. They are effeminate, they are feminine men, they are female husbands, they are eunuch boyfriend, and they are bachelors who are undeserving of being a hubby or babu or shona or something like that. So they cannot become anybody's babu, they cannot become anybody's shona, they cannot perform true love to girlfriends. So they are subordinate masculinity. Okay, and they are transsexuals, they are the transgenders, and that's why subordinate masculinity gives birth to queer studies, LGBTQ studies, masculinity studies, and all kinds of gender studies, as it were. And transsexual studies, and also transgender studies, something that I am extremely interested these days, because we cannot deny how much transgender studies is helping masculinity studies and queer studies to progress feminism further. Because most people understand that feminism is only about those women who have vagina between their legs. Most women, they understand that feminism is about those women who are heterosexual, and those women who are heterosexual and married with 10 children, and those women who are heterosexual, married with 10 children, and whose husbands beat them day in and day out. No, feminism is also about those women who do not have anything between their two legs, and also something between their two legs. So feminism has got nothing to do with sexed female body. So I will, and that's why queer theory is so much indebted to transgender studies these days, and something that is also giving birth to masculinity studies in early 21st century, something that I'm genuinely interested in a continuation of queer studies and gender studies and LGBTQ plus studies. So, okay, so what I am saying is very simple. That in Murder of Roger Ackroyd, we have a detective. Now, this is the concluding part of this YouTube live on Agatha Christie's Murder of Roger Ackroyd. The detective or the investigator in the Murder of Roger Ackroyd by Agatha Christie is Hercule Poirot. Or in anglicized pronunciation, Hercule Poirot. He is a Belgian detective. and he has very short mustache. He does not have gun or revolver for investigation. He is not exactly a bodybuilder or a gym attendant. That is, he is not exactly like a Hulk or Dabang or John Abraham in Dostana. He is very short in stature, almost effeminate in his public behavior, and his name is Hercule Poirot. That is Herculean Poirot. Now listen to this last part of this lecture in my YouTube live very, very, very carefully. Otherwise, it could ruin your whole last 1 hour lecture for this live in my own YouTube channel. His name is made up of 2 words, Hercule and Poirot. Hercule is etymologically drawn from Hercules. Hercule is etymologically drawn from Hercules. And Poirot is something that is effeminacy, non-manliness, something that I call subordinate masculinity, according to R.W. Connell. Therefore, Hercule Poirot etymologically means a male detective with femininity, or in more simplified gender studies terminology, an effeminate male investigator. I'll say it again, an effeminate male detective. Therefore, Hercule Poirot does not fit into the typical brand of Sherlock Holmes. The last line of my YouTube live. Is therefore Agatha Christie making a strong critique, I'll say it again, is therefore Agatha Christie making a very strong critique of male writers, patriarchal, masculinist, Sherlock Holmesian detective genre. Is therefore Christie becoming a feminist detective novelist? Is therefore Christie introducing a hero who is detective? Yes. He will solve problem? Yes. He will detect and investigate successfully? Yes, yes, yes. But not without gun, but with intellect. Not without masculinity, but with subordinate masculinity. Not with Hercules, the hegemonic male, but with Poirot, the intellectual, ratiocinative intellectual. And therefore, I would conclude this lecture with 2 remarks. Agatha Christie is introducing 2 paradigms, and those two paradigms would be subverting, that is to say, would be challenging the entire established genre of detective literature.
And what were the established genres of detective literature? Male detective come and solve everything and restore the balance. And male detective will have to be a masculine and hegemonic and complicit. And Agatha Christie is introducing a male detective, yes, because Hercule Poirot is male, right? All right. But he is not necessarily hegemonic masculinity nor complicit masculinity. He belongs to what R.W. Connell calls the subordinate masculinity. Therefore, not only is she changing the trend that a writer of detective novel will have to be male because she is female herself, but also introducing a male investigator detective who is non-hegemonic, non-complicit, subordinate masculinity. Extremely effeminate. That is to say that detection and investigation and solution and reconciliation does not need this. It needs this. So probably for the first time in the history of detective literature, Christie is introducing the cult of effeminate masculinity, and the key to solution does not lie in how much strength you have in your forearm. The solution lies in how much intellectual ratiocination you are capable through your head. So something that Satyajit Ray and Feludas are always shown smoking Charminar cigar, wearing dhuti. So can we therefore say that Bengali detectives are more indebted to Agatha Christie and less indebted to Arthur Conan Doyle? Thank you. Thank you so much for being so supportive, cooperative, and tolerant and patient with my YouTube channel. If you like, please subscribe and share the channel and help me reach to more young generation with my lectures, with my ratiocination, and with my Poirot intellect, which is more subordinate and less hegemony, which is more effeminate than masculine, which is more Poirot than Herculean, which is more Agatha Christian than Arthur Conan Doylean. Thank you. Thank you so much. Love you all. Take care. Stay safe. Stay home. And don't show your masculinity during pandemic. Thank you. Signing operation from my own YouTube channel. Bye-bye.